Chapter 13, Dr. Frank. Before I tell you of the true catalyst that led to my tale of woe and ruin, I must first start by telling you a different story, one even I could not expect in my wildest nightmares. By the end of that summer, I had finally perfected the creature that would change not only the course of my life, but the future of all human life. Now that I had successfully created my little tarsier pups, I sold the ones that survived, that is, those that hadn't been cannibalized by the parents, as so often happens, as well as their parents on the black market to Indonesians who spent a pricey penny to keep them as designer pets. I planned to use the money I made for more research, or maybe even my own separate lab for a new IVG clinic. I could already see my work would be heavily sought after once I managed to successfully create a human using the same means and could announce I'd made the perfect human species. My species would have eyes of the clearest blue, just like my father's, that had transfixed my mother so deeply so many years ago. I imagined this creature would have the masculine stature and musculature of the most admired athlete, the smoothest complexion that merged together the bronze coloring of my mother and the pale tones of the paperwhites that held so much power and influence in the world. Now that everything was in place, I planned to reunite with Hannah. Although I imagined she would be hesitant at first, I would convince her to trust that we would make, together, the perfect children to reflect all of our best qualities. But there was an added variable we could not have ever seen coming. While I was so fixated on my research at Oxford, Ezra had pursued his own journey. I had hoped, given my father's death, Ezra might return to those pursuits that had previously brought him so much joy. But it was too late. However, on the other hand, it did not seem as though Ezra had returned to my father's line of work either, which gave me some small comfort, as I assumed it meant he had let go of my father's deathbed mandate that we marry. At some point during my reclusive days of endless research, Ezra sent a letter saying that among other trivialities, seeing how my work had brought me such focus and distraction from our father's death, he had also decided to study the reproductive sciences. Just as I had on that day with Hannah so many moons ago, I became enraged at the idea Ezra would shadow me. I could only assume that he too intended to thwart the progress I was trying to make as a woman scientist. After a long night in the lab, I retrieved Ezra's letter again from my nightstand where I had tossed it a few days prior, and shredded it with my bare hands like an animal, promptly ridding my house of the evidence. Now that the letter no longer existed in the world, I banished it from my mind, convinced he would never conquer all the gains I had made since I last saw him. Since I hadn't heard a word of him from my fellow colleagues and the other prominent scientists in my field, I decided I had overreacted. Perhaps Ezra was trying to provoke me by antagonizing my known territorial nature. I returned to my work. Even though it angered me that Ezra would even attempt to take what was mine, I was much too involved in my own research to give it attention for too long. Besides, we were so far apart from one another at this point, what harm could it do? Certainly, he would not be able to compete with me. I had been at this work my entire life, and he had been pursuing this new line of work for what, a year? 2 at best? I suppose my ego being what it was, there was a tiny part of me that arose when the anxious part of me dissipated. One that took it as a praise he was seeing my life as a model from which to find direction. But I would realize much too late Ezra's mirroring was only further evidence of the fact that Ezra still had not let go of the vow our father demanded we make to each other. I would learn later that it was Ezra's belief that if he followed my intellectual pursuit, then maybe I would be more inclined to join him in this wedding pact. Although he had known about Hannah so many years ago, provoking my father to burn all of the Kalele clothes from my beloved trunk, I believe Ezra assumed Hannah was long gone from my life, and that I was much too obsessed with my work to have found a new companion. Just as I pushed away all I loved to discover the secret behind creating life, so too did Ezra refuse to reflect upon any obstacle that could get in the way of fulfilling his father's deathbed promise. I did not think further about this at the time. Ezra simply was of no great concern to me. No one was, truly. All that mattered to me was my work. No one mattered when I was so singularly occupied with creating a being that would no longer require the need of men. In retrospect, I should have thought more about what his mirroring of my own inquiries might have meant for my future in this realm. But, whatever the case, he wrote to me again, informing me he would be in town, and asked to come visit the lab. "Perhaps we could have a long overdue reunion," he signed off sweetly. He had heard great things about my prestigious facilities, he wrote in the letter, and it was these words of praise and validation I found myself charmed by enough to allow Ezra to briefly pause my work. Ezra also suggested that if I found his portfolio to my liking, that perhaps my lab might find a suitable position for him. As he started to come closer and closer to orbiting my own universe, the disconcerted feeling I had over him encroaching upon a territory I had long claimed as my own began to grow more intensely. But nonetheless, I naively imagined I could take one evening out of my work to share a simple dinner with him, politely decline his request for a job, and that would be the end of it. Of course, I thought to myself, I would generously offer him a reference, and to that end, I brought with me a list of top embryology labs in the country, stored safely out of sight in my briefcase, one almost identical to the one I had borrowed from my father that day long ago. Deep brown leather with gold locks. I was certain that, in the end, he would seek out a lab far from mine. I wish I had realized that it was never the career he was after, only me. When the receptionist brought Ezra to my office, it was hard not to think about the many years I had known Ezra throughout my life, and how different Ezra appeared to me from the young, sweet, cherubic child I envisioned in my mind. His golden curls had been gone for many years now, and the bright yellow of his locks had been replaced by a dark brown that reminded me of the chocolate candies he used to buy at the market for 5 cents, and pop into his mouth before my mother saw him. Perfectly coiffed, Ezra kept the slightest hint of a bouffant just above his forehead, while the rest of his hair was shaved quite close to the back of the neck and sides of his head. When we stood to greet one another, I was stunned at how tall he had become. His frame, long and lean like a beanpole, was eerily similar to our father's. The soft, delicate nature I had so long associated with my Ezra had been replaced with a rigid, confident air, one I wish I had questioned more at the time. "Sister, cousin, darling, how are you?" Ezra joked as he greeted me, referencing the many roles we had performed for each other since we were young children. This new Ezra was a stranger, unrecognizable from the boy I grew up with. He offered me each cheek to kiss. I brusquely offered him my hand instead. Ezra smirked at me and took it. I was wearing a 3-piece pinstripe suit, 2-tone knot cufflinks that were silver and blue, and men's brown leather Oxfords to match my briefcase. As I shook Ezra's hand, I motioned for my receptionist, Leonard, to be excused. "Leonard, please bring my car around front and make sure to lock up when you leave for the day. This is my brother, Ezra, and we will be having dinner down the street. I'll return to work afterwards." I readjusted my cuff at my wrist, lightly fingering my cufflink. "Yes, Dr. Frank," Leonard replied, with a deferential nod, shutting the door behind him. Ezra observed the exchange between us, the fact that my receptionist referred to me by Dr. Frank rather than our given surname, without saying a word. Our dinner was fairly harmless. We chatted about our different paths towards similar scientific goals since we'd last seen one another. Ezra told me he had decided to leave our father's business behind and how he came to be interested in IVF. But the story felt forced and flat. But mostly, he wanted to spend our time together sharing memories about our father, not work. I made it clear that this was not a topic of interest to me. It seemed to catch him a bit off guard, but he adapted quickly enough, and we moved on to the other superficial topics of conversation. Nevertheless, the dinner was relatively innocuous, as I had anticipated. I felt some small worrying of anxiety beneath the skin, but I convinced myself it was only due to how strange and unfamiliar this man, whom I once felt closer to than our mother, seemed. It was when I began to walk with Ezra to his car at the lab that the nightmare began. I began to rifle through my briefcase for the list of labs he could contact for employment. "I'm sorry we don't have any openings right now, Ezra." I continued rummaging through the briefcase for the printouts. "But here is a list of the top labs in the country. I would be happy to write you a letter of reference if you find yourself interested in a position at one of them." "Sister," he said, placing his fingers around my wrist. We were standing in front of his car. "I don't need your pity or your charity." I looked down at his hand holding my wrist and back up at his face to ascertain if his touch was aggressive or gentle. "Could you please let go?" I asked quickly, scanning the parking lot to confirm we were alone, and many feet from anyone that would see or hear us. The dark was menacing. I knew the power a man held in his fingertips. I had seen my father with my mother. I knew it wouldn't take much for Ezra to hurt me. No one would stop him. He gripped my wrist tighter. "Ezra, I'm asking you to stop," I said, this time more forcefully than the last. Ezra leaned forward to give me an unwanted kiss on my lips. I turned my face to shrug him off, but before I could, he cornered me next to the driver's door of his car, pushy and hostile in a manner I had never before witnessed from him. I had not known Ezra as a man. He pinned my shoulders against the cold metal of the door with one arm. With the other arm, he grabbed a ring box out of his coat pocket, opening it with his free thumb. Inside, the velvet ring box was an extravagant diamond ring. "This is not up for debate, Zoel," he said. Hearing that old name again, a name I had not used for many years, made me nauseous. It was hard to speak, so I remained silent. "In order for our father to have eternal peace," he insisted, we wed. "I hope you will understand why we must do this. After we marry, I plan to take control of your lab. Oil is a bit unpredictable for my taste, so I'm sure Father would agree that letting the business go was the best deal I could have done for the family. The best thing I could have done for the family." Ezra took the ring out of the box and began to lift my hand. I took advantage of the temporary distraction and kicked him in the ankle. "You will never get my lab. I will never marry you," I said, although my entire body pulsated with rage and fear. I remained calm from an innate need to survive this man in front of me, who was no longer my brother, cousin, or anyone I would call a tender heart, like I had so many years ago. Ezra grabbed his ankle and started rubbing it vigorously, cursing at me. At that moment, a car pulled up next to us. Their headlights blaring, the window rolled down. "Hey, you okay?" a young woman asked. "Oh, yes, madam. There's no need to worry. We're Ezra began. But by then, I had slipped into the woman's car and asked her to drive me to the garage. The next day, I went to Leonard and told him to tell the security detail in the lab that Ezra was to have no access to any part of the lab, in case he claimed he had my permission. I wouldn't find out for some time that my warnings wouldn't prevent Ezra from acting however he wished. It took me 2 weeks to recover from Ezra's visit. I couldn't work. I couldn't sleep. I spent many nights in the lab, my eyes peeled for the tiniest shift in atmosphere. The slightest hint of a noise that would alert me Ezra had returned to lay claim to the only thing I had built with my own 2 hands. Ezra wasn't even my blood relative. How could he stake claim over something he didn't even inherit? Come to think of it, I don't even know if my father ever legally adopted him from the orphanage. If he could have gotten away with it, he would have just grabbed him from the patch of grass that one bright morning in Norway. The orphanage would have had no idea where to even look for this little cherubic toddler who was playing outside one moment and gone the next. Although Ezra had come into our lives suddenly, Perhaps it had never been sudden for my father. Perhaps this adoption had been in the works for some time, kept a secret from even my mother. All I knew was this: I had worked way too hard and for far too long to let this miniaturized version of my father take what had always been mine. But as each day passed into the next, and I did not see any sign of Ezra, my pulse began to recede, and I proceeded with my project to create new life in ways we had only dreamed of. It was time to bring Hannah into this universe, and I had traveled in isolated and alone. That had long been the reason for my disappearance. On one of the first days I felt secure enough to sleep in my own home, I made my way to my nightstand, where a stack of unopened letters from Hannah sat. I grabbed the one with the most recent postmark, and without opening it, I copied the return address from her envelope onto my own. I took out a piece of paper and began to write. My dearest Hannah, I am so deeply sorry for how absent I've been to you these many months. I hope, if you accept my invitation, that you will forgive me once you learn what I've been doing all of this time. I can't wait to show you what I have been up to lately. Please come to me. I have much news for you. News I believe will bring you much happiness. At least, that is my wish. Enclosed is a ticket by plane, train, and bus, one way, to where I live and work. Please come as soon as you can. I need you. Yours, Z. 2 weeks later, Hannah arrived at the lab by the car service I had arranged for her. She was still as luminous and elegant as I had remembered her, but I now saw fatigue etched into the lines of her face, and her deep-set eyes that had not been there before. It saddened me, but I didn't mention a word of my observations. All that mattered to me in that moment, in any moment, was the task at hand that I hoped Hannah would help me bring to fruition. Much to her boredom and disinterest, I began relaying to her the scientific technicalities of the discoveries I had made since we'd last seen one another. Hannah, remember that fight we had, our first fight, when we were eating on our blanket by the willow? I nudged her. She smiled. I couldn't possibly forget how I found all that exciting research for you and you shredded it in little bits. Hannah's thick curls fell around each side of her face as she laughed. I know, I said, laughing along with her. How absolutely terrible I was then. I looked downward in mock guilt. But look, now, I've discovered that what you found that one day all those years ago has led me to my greatest work. I grabbed her hand, the first time we touched in so many moons, and lifted her chin up with my free hand so that her eyes met mine. This is something we can do now, together. Hannah looked at me with openness, a hint of confusion. Here, love, let me show you. Continuing to hold her hand, I guided her into the restricted lab so that she could see the egg I had made with my own blood and skin. This is an egg I made of my own cells. In the beginning of our child, of all that we could ever want for our future, we don't even need a real egg or sperm to do it. Take a look. My voice began to accelerate, turning wild in my throat. I couldn't help it. It was the moment I had been waiting for my entire life. All I needed was for Hannah to say yes. I stood behind her as she looked into the microscope, which had adjusted so that she could see the egg clearly. Wow, Z, that's incredible. But what about the sperm? Hannah ventured carefully, her hand reaching back to touch my shoulder as she looked at me in the dish below. Don't you see? I grabbed her by both shoulders and turned her around to face me. She took a step back, and I tried to reel in my excitement. We can do the same thing. I was thinking, what if the sperm could be used with the same process, but from you? Then our child could truly be ours together, just like a traditional man and woman's can be. My breath grew rapid and hot, burning my chest and throat as it poured out of me. Hannah chewed on her lip and didn't say a word. Do you mind if I take a few minutes to take a walk through the building to think through all of this? She began to respond, but I interrupted her. Don't even give it a second thought, please, I said, gesturing toward the door. Take all the time you need. I attempted to feign patience, but my body tingled with urgency. I lost track of how long she was gone from the lab. Just as I was starting to lose all confidence that she would join me on this magnificent quest, I heard her soft first fist knock on the secured door to the room that contained the egg I had created from my own matter. When I opened the door, Hannah fell into my arms. She scattered 100 little kisses across my face, like the touch of little flying things. Let's start a life together, she whispered in my ears. I sighed rapturously, but Hannah's rapture and mine were altogether very distinguished from one another. You mean it? I asked, breathless, my face flushed from her touch. Yes, love. I would love nothing more than for us to finally start our life together. But... She paused, biting her lip. Yes, darling, what is it? I grew anxious again. I need you to understand that my work is important for me, too. Once the baby is born, I will want to focus on my own career. I can't wait to tell you more about it. In one of the letters, I had read she was pursuing a doctorate in gender studies, but I assumed once she felt the excitement of this far superior work, she would abandon her path. That was the path of so many. Oh, but of course! And I want you to tell me everything, I assured her, taking her into my arms and kissing her. But who will carry it? She asked after we came up for air. Oh, yes, we should talk about that, I started, clearing my throat. I was hoping that you would be willing to carry the child. Since this will be my first experiment of this nature, I want to take copious notes on how the fetus develops in utero. It would just be easier if I wasn't being impacted by the effects of pregnancy, I said. Your first... She paused. Experiment? You know what I mean, darling. I held her in my arms. I mean, it will be the start of our future, but it will also be the beginning of my work, too. You understand, don't you? I moved my head back from where it rested on her shoulder to scan her face for agreement. Her stoic expression gradually grew into a grin. Well, as the femme, I always assumed I would carry our child. I think pregnancy is such a magical opportunity not everybody has the privilege to experience, she admitted, grinning. I didn't dare assume, but the idea of pregnancy, of having one's condition so externalized on your physical form, has never quite appealed to me, to be frank, I smirked. That reminds me, you call yourself Dr. Frank these days? She winked. Yes, it suits me. I call myself Z for short. Z Frank, I like it, she said, nuzzling her nose into my neck. After weeks of painstaking labor and calculation, I was able to create viable sperm cells from Hannah's blood and skin. We were elated when the day came to fertilize the egg into an embryo we would implant into Hannah's uterus. However, our exciting mission would be thwarted, and we would not learn until too late how disastrously. I would learn something was amiss on the day that I planned to fertilize the egg. When I opened the secret lab which held my egg, I noticed something strange and terrifying. The egg was no longer, and there, in its place, was a fully fertilized embryo. Hannah's sperm remained in its place, intact. No one was allowed in that room. No one. I panicked. I fled the room and ran to my office, immediately summoning Leonard. Dr. Frank, how can I assist? Leonard asked, standing close to the door. I held my hands in my lap underneath the desk, trying as hard as I could to hold them tight enough to prevent them from tremoring. Is there anything you need to tell me? I asked as calmly as possible. Oh, well, we have had to switch out a few of the security personnel for a number of various reasons. I thought you needn't be burdened with while you work on your important study, he said. I see. Could you check to see if they let anyone that was unauthorized into the lab in the last 5 days? I asked, my voice shallower than I had ever remembered hearing it. Certainly, Doctor. Is everything all right? Just please, go ask them as soon as possible. Without a word of response, Leonard excused himself. I sat in my office with my eyes closed, rolling beneath their lids, my heart jolting in my chest. What would I tell Hannah? It couldn't be possible, I reasoned with myself. There were so many layers of security one had to pass to enter that secret room. But how else could an egg have been fertilized? Who else would have been able to do this, and so quickly? As more questions ran feverishly through my mind, I was disrupted by a loud series of knocks on the door. "Dr. Frank, it's me, Leonard. I have the information you're after." "Please come in." Leonard entered with a young man I had never seen before, dressed in civilian clothes, his head hanging low. That is when I knew what happened. "Dr. Frank, this is Preston. I am afraid he has a very distressing news. As you can see, he will no longer be welcome on the premises. Go ahead, Preston. Tell Dr. Frank what you told me. Dr. Frank, you and I can change the passcode after I complete his exit interview." Preston told me that an incredibly well-dressed and well-mannered young man insisted that he was my brother and that I had given him permission to access the lab so he could assist me with my current work. Of course, it did not occur to Preston to be suspicious of a man who claimed to be my family. The secret room required a special passcode to enter, and since I never foresaw myself in a situation where I would have to protect my property from Ezra, I did not think twice about using Kalele as my secret passcode. Who, in the middle of the American South, would ever know this word, this Indonesian name for what I was? So few people even considered this possibility when they saw me in my suits and ties, my treasured briefcase. I have never uttered this word aloud to a single person besides my mother and Hannah, but Ezra had his ways. The damage was done. I had come so far. I couldn't stop now. I couldn't let Ezra's act of sabotage undo all the years of sacrificing sleep, food, and all other comforts in order to see this work through to fruition. I would not let a man stop me now. So I made a decision, one that would forever alter the course of my life, Hannah's life, the lives of so many others. I chose to proceed as planned, and I withheld the truth from Hannah about the embryo. That the embryo did not contain Hannah's genetic material, but mine and Ezra's. A few days later, the embryo I had painstakingly created after many months of work was successfully transferred into Hannah's uterus. We were elated to verify by ultrasound a few weeks later that my experiment was successful. Hannah was pregnant. However, our delight was short-lived. There were occasions during Hannah's pregnancy in which I worried about the fallout of Ezra's actions. I didn't know where he had trained or how well he knew the techniques of IVG. It was not until after the first trimester I learned what had happened as a consequence of Ezra's actions and my refusal to wait. Since we were already in uncharted territory, we had no idea what kind of mutations this might ultimately cause the fetus. I had worked so tirelessly to create without egg or sperm. But it was during an ultrasound after the first trimester that I deduced Ezra and I were both carriers for a genetic mutation associated with gigantism and acromegaly. Hannah's belly was already beginning to stretch the fabric of her oversized t-shirt. Fatigue and confusion crowded her thoughts more and more each day, but even in her state, she could tell I was keeping something from her. "Z, what is it? Is something wrong with the baby?" she asked, her face lined with worry. I sat next to her and laid my head against her belly while she stroked my hair. "Tell me, Z, what is it? Whatever it is, we have to work this out together." I started to cry. Hannah repositioned herself so that she was sitting upright. I lifted my head to face her. "Z, whatever is happening to my body, I need you to tell me what's going on now." She spoke with an insistence I had never heard from her before. It startled me. "I don't even know how to begin to tell you this, but—" I paused. Hannah uncharacteristically ran her fingers through her hair. "The day I planned to use your sperm to fertilize my egg, well, I discovered that the egg had already been fertilized. It was already an embryo." I took a deep breath. "What? By who? Whose sperm is inside me, Z?" Hannah clutched her belly, and I couldn't tell if she was protecting it from the world or from me. "Ezra had coerced his way into the lab. It's Ezra's sperm. I didn't tell you because I was hoping everything would turn out in the end and that this would be the first of many children we would have. But it looks like both Ezra and I are carriers for a genetic mutation that might be linked to gigantism. I cannot believe you would do this. I cannot believe you would care about your precious work over my life, over your child. You could have just started the process over, but you never listen. You are always so impatient, so self-obsessed to be the idol at all costs. A single tear froze on Hannah's cheek, but it was one of rage, an emotion I always associated with myself, but never with her. She rushed out of the room. Hannah did not come home for many nights. All kinds of dreadful thoughts ran through my mind, mostly about what would happen to my work now that the woman carrying the child that bore my life's work was gone, now that the child that held what mattered could end in a miscarriage or a stillbirth, or even worse. I tried to banish the worst-case scenarios from my mind. After several days, Hannah returned to me while I was at home, different than she was before, composed, the temperament of ice. I have some things to say, Hannah said, sitting with me at a small wooden dining table where she had found me. I reached for her hand, but she kept hers in her lap, underneath the table. I retrieved mine after a moment and did the same. It is too late to have an abortion, now that the state has imposed tighter restrictions on late-term abortions. I suppose we could travel out of state or even fly to Canada, but it's too risky. Because of the special circumstances under which this child was created, you are the only person that can most safely bring this child into the world. Since you did not give me all the information to make a sound decision about what was to happen inside my own body, I am now having this child against my will. I am nothing more than an empty vessel to you, a container to hold your secrets and your ambitions. I see that now, even though it is far too late for me to do anything about it. Hannah took a drink from a glass of water in front of her. I started to respond, but she silenced me with one hand. I will see this through. I have no choice that won't also endanger my life as well. But after I have this experiment, as you so aptly called it, I will wash my hands of it, and of you. She grabbed her glass of water from the table and walked into the second bedroom and did not emerge from her room for the rest of the night. Hannah did not speak to me for weeks after discovering what Ezra had done and what I had let continue without a word. At first, I gave her the distance she clearly desired, but I grew weary of it after some time and threw many fits, hoping to convince her to speak to me again. I missed her warmth and her openness, her kisses and her embrace. I didn't exactly blame her, for it was true that she was now being forced to carry a child against her will, largely so that I could work out my ideas on her body. Her one opportunity to have the child be part hers squandered by my own brother. And to make matters worse, now this child would possibly be born with a genetic disorder that would even ruin the entire purpose of its conception. We did not know what would come of this creation now that it had been tampered with by the very source we had attempted to relinquish in our process. Even with all of this, I did not hold myself fully accountable for what happened to Hannah. It was too easy to blame Ezra for all of my woes and for Hannah's spurning of me. Hannah continued onwards with her pregnancy, as she had no other option, and our relationship became that of two colleagues watching a vine grow out of a mound of dirt. There was only one thing left to do now: wait.